There is an old man sitting alone on a park bench in Rome. It is the year 170. His hands are trembling, not from fear but from age. His joints ache. His eyesight has dimmed. And yet, in his private journal that night, he writes something extraordinary. He writes that his body is failing him, piece by piece, day by day, and that this is exactly as it should be. That old man was Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, and he understood something almost nobody understands today. He understood that aging is not a tragedy to be feared. It is a craft to be mastered. And in the next 30 minutes, you are going to learn exactly how he mastered it, along with 6 other timeless habits that the greatest Stoic philosophers in history used to grow old with strength, clarity, and peace, instead of decline, fear, and regret. If you have ever looked in the mirror and felt a quiet dread about growing older, if you have ever watched a parent or grandparent fade and wondered if that is simply what awaits all of us, this video will change how you see the rest of your life. Stay until the end, because the 7th habit is the one that changes everything the other 6 cannot. Welcome to Wisdom of the Stoics, ancient wisdom for the modern mind. On this channel, we take the writings of history's greatest thinkers, men who ruled empires, survived exile, and stared death in the face without flinching, and we translate their wisdom into something you can actually use today. If that sounds like something you need in your life, consider subscribing, because we release new episodes on how to live with strength and clarity every single week. Let's talk honestly about aging for a moment, because most of us have been lied to about it. We have been told a story, mostly by advertising, mostly by fear, that aging is something that happens to us, that it is a slow theft, that one day you are strong and capable and full of plans, and the next day, seemingly overnight, you are diminished, weaker, slower, forgotten. This story is so deeply embedded in modern culture that most people spend their 40s and 50s in a kind of low-grade panic, watching the years tick by, trying to outrun something that cannot be outrun. But here is the truth the Stoics discovered over 2,000 years ago, a truth modern science is only now beginning to confirm. Aging is not something that happens to you. Aging is something you participate in. The body will change. That part is not optional. But how you age, the sharpness of your mind at 70, the strength in your legs at 80, the peace in your heart at 90, all of that is shaped far more by daily habits and inner discipline than by the simple passage of years. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius in his final years, said that it is not that we have a short life, but that we waste much of it. He was not talking about the young. He was talking about people exactly like the person watching this video right now, people who assume there will always be more time to build the habits that matter, until suddenly there isn't. The Stoics were not interested in adding years to life for the sake of it. They were interested in something far more valuable, adding life to years. And they left behind a blueprint, forged not in comfortable palaces but in exile, in plague, in war, in the daily grind of ordinary Roman life, for exactly how to do that. So today, we are going to walk through 7 golden habits, 7 daily disciplines drawn directly from Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca that were used by people who lived hard lives in a hard world, and who nonetheless grew old with remarkable vitality of mind and spirit. We will follow the story of a woman named Elena, 73 years old, whose life you will come to know intimately over the course of this video, because sometimes the only way to truly understand a philosophy is to watch it lived. Let's begin. Habit 1. Train the body like you train the mind. Elena used to believe that exercise was for the young, that once you passed 60, the best you could do was preserve what was left. Move carefully, avoid injury, and otherwise sit still and let time do what time does. This belief nearly cost her everything. At 68, after a fall in her kitchen left her with a fractured hip, she spent 4 months in a wheelchair, and during those 4 months, she watched her strength evaporate at a terrifying speed. It was during her recovery that her grandson, a physical therapist, gave her a book of Marcus Aurelius's private writings, the Meditations, and inside she found a sentence that stopped her cold. Marcus wrote to himself that the body must be treated with the same discipline as the mind, not indulged, not neglected, but trained, because a weak body drags a strong mind down with it into confusion and despair. This was not an abstract idea for Marcus. He ruled an empire while suffering from chronic illness, likely a form of stomach ailment that plagued him for most of his adult life. He fought wars on the frontier in his 50s, sleeping in military tents in freezing weather. He did not have the luxury of treating his body as an afterthought, because his body was the instrument through which everything else in his life had to happen. And this is the first golden habit the Stoics teach us about aging. The body is not separate from the mind. It is the vessel that carries the mind through the world. And neglecting it is not humility. It is a slow form of self-betrayal. Here is what makes this habit so powerful, and so different from the way modern culture talks about fitness and aging. Modern culture tells older adults to take it easy, to rest, to accept decline as the natural order. The Stoics believed the opposite. They believed that physical discipline was a moral practice, not a vanity project. Epictetus, who himself lived with a permanently disabled leg, likely the result of an injury sustained during his years as a slave, never used his disability as an excuse to abandon physical discipline. He walked. He trained his students to endure cold and discomfort, and he insisted that the body, whatever condition it was in, should be pushed toward its fullest capacity, not its most comfortable limit. Elena took this seriously. After her recovery, once she was cleared by her doctors, she did not return to stillness. She began walking every single morning, rain or shine, starting with 5 minutes around her block. Within a year, she was walking 3 miles a day. She added resistance training with light bands twice a week, something her doctor initially worried about and then later celebrated, because her bone density stopped declining and actually began to improve. Here is a fact that should genuinely astonish you. Modern research on muscle physiology has confirmed that skeletal muscle remains remarkably responsive to resistance training well into a person's 90s. Studies on nonagenarians who began strength training for the first time in their lives showed measurable increases in muscle mass and strength within just 12 weeks. The body Marcus Aurelius described, one that responds to discipline regardless of age, is not ancient superstition. It is biological fact that science took 2,000 years to catch up with. But there is a deeper layer to this habit that goes beyond muscles and bone density. When Eleanor committed to daily movement, something shifted in her that had nothing to do with physical strength. She described it to her grandson this way. For the first time since her fall, she felt like she had agency again. She was not a passenger in her own decline. She was an active participant in her own life. This is precisely what Marcus Aurelius meant when he wrote that we should treat the body as something entrusted to our care, like a soldier entrusted with a post he must not abandon. The daily walk, the daily stretch, the daily movement, however small, is not just physical maintenance. It is a declaration made fresh every single morning that you have not surrendered. If you are watching this and thinking that you are too old to begin, or too out of shape, or that the window has closed, I want you to sit with this question for a moment, and if it moves something in you, drop it in the comments below, because this community deserves to see it. What is one small physical habit you have been putting off, telling yourself you will start someday? Because the Stoics would tell you that someday is not a day of the week, and the only day discipline has ever existed is today. Habit 2. Master what you can control. Release what you cannot. There is a particular kind of suffering that comes with growing older, one that has nothing to do with the body and everything to do with the mind. It is the suffering of grief compounded again and again as friends pass away, as the world changes in ways you no longer recognize, as your own capabilities shift and sometimes diminish. Elena experienced this most sharply not through her hip fracture, but 3 years later, when her husband of 41 years, a man named Thomas, passed away suddenly from a heart attack while gardening on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. In the weeks that followed, Elena told her grandson that she felt like the ground beneath her had simply vanished. Everything she had built her daily life around, decades of shared routines, shared decisions, shared silence, was gone in an instant. And it was during this period of raw grief that she returned to the philosophy that had already begun reshaping her physical life, and found something she needed even more urgently: Epictetus's central teaching, the dichotomy of control. Epictetus taught his students, many of whom were also grieving, exiled or enslaved, that all things in life fall into one of two categories. There are things within our control, our judgments, our responses, our efforts, our character, and there are things outside our control, other people's actions, the length of our lives, the health of our bodies, the timing of loss. He said that the entire source of human misery comes from confusing these two categories, from trying to control what cannot be controlled and from neglecting what can. This teaching did not make Elena's grief disappear, and it was never meant to. The Stoics were not advocating for emotional suppression, whatever popular caricatures suggest. Marcus Aurelius himself wept over losses in his own life. But what this teaching gave Elena was something different. It gave her permission to stop fighting the unfightable. She could not control that Thomas had died. She could not control the timing, the suddenness, the unfairness of it happening on an ordinary Tuesday instead of some dramatic, prepared-for moment. But she could control how she met each day afterward. She could control whether she isolated herself or reached out to her daughter. She could control whether she let her grief calcify into permanent bitterness or allowed it to soften slowly into a kind of grateful sorrow, the sorrow of having loved someone worth grieving. This is where the Stoic approach to aging becomes radically different from the anxious, control-obsessed approach so common today. So much of modern anti-aging culture is built on an exhausting, ultimately doomed attempt to control the uncontrollable, to control how the skin looks, to control every biomarker, to control the exact number of years lived, as if life were a project that could be engineered into permanence. The Stoics would say this entire approach is misdirected effort, spent trying to command a storm instead of learning to build a sturdier house. The truth is that some physical decline is simply outside anyone's control. Genetics play a role no discipline can fully override. Loss is guaranteed to visit everyone who loves deeply enough to risk it. Trying to control these things is a war you cannot win. And Epictetus would say that fighting an unwinnable war is not courage. It is a failure to see clearly. What is within your control, always, at every age, in every circumstance, is your response. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you have power over your mind, not outside events, and that realizing this is where you find strength. For Elena, this became a daily practice, not just a comforting idea. Each morning she began asking herself a simple question drawn from this philosophy: what today is within my power, and what today must I release? Some days the answer was small, whether to call her daughter or wait for her daughter to call. Some days the answer was enormous, whether to let Thomas's death be the end of her own vitality or the beginning of a new, harder one kind of strength. I want to pause here and ask you something, because this habit is perhaps the most quietly transformative one on this list, and I think it deserves real reflection rather than passive listening. Think of one thing right now in your own life that you have been spending enormous emotional energy trying to control, something that genuinely sits outside your power. Maybe it is someone else's opinion of you. Maybe it is a diagnosis you cannot undo. Maybe it is simply the fact of growing older itself. Consider just for a moment what might change in your daily peace of mind if you set that particular burden down and picked up instead the only tool that has ever truly been yours to wield: your own response. If this idea resonates with you, let us know in the comments, because this channel exists to have exactly this kind of conversation with people who are ready to think differently about the years ahead of them. Habit 3. Practice the view from above. There is a meditative technique that Marcus Aurelius returned to again and again in his private writings, one that modern psychologists have since studied and validated as a powerful tool for reducing anxiety and increasing perspective. Though the Stoics had no laboratories, no brain scans, only careful, disciplined introspection. Marcus called it the view from above. He would imagine himself rising, in his mind's eye, above the city of Rome, above the empire itself, until he could see the whole sweep of human life from a great height, armies marching, marketplaces bustling, families grieving and celebrating, all of it unfolding across the vast, indifferent landscape of time. From that height, he wrote, our individual worries, our status, our appearance, even our fear of death shrink down to their proper size. Elena discovered her own version of this practice almost by accident, roughly 8 months after Thomas's death. She had taken up a habit, recommended gently by her grandson, of sitting outside each evening as the sun went down, and simply watching the sky change. At first this felt indulgent, even strange, an old woman staring at clouds. But over weeks, something shifted in her. She began to notice how small her daily anxieties felt against the enormity of the sky. The fear she carried about her own mortality, the low hum of dread that had followed her since Thomas's passing, began slowly to soften into something closer to acceptance, even wonder. This is precisely what Marcus Aurelius was describing. He wrote that all things are woven together, and the web is holy, and that no part of it is out of harmony with any other part, that everything is connected, and everything passes into everything else. This was not depressing to him. It was liberating, because if you and your worries and your fears about aging are simply one small thread in an unimaginably vast tapestry stretching across all of human history, then the pressure to control every detail of your own decline, to fight every wrinkle and every grey hair as though it were a personal insult, begins to feel almost comically small. There is real psychological substance behind this practice, something researchers today call self-distancing, or more broadly, cognitive reappraisal through perspective shift. Studies on aging populations have found that individuals who regularly practice this kind of perspective-taking, mentally stepping back from their immediate circumstances to view their life within a larger context, report significantly lower rates of anxiety and depression related to aging, and higher reported life satisfaction, even when their physical health outcomes are comparable to those who do not practice this technique. In other words, the view from above is not simply poetic. It appears to change how the aging brain processes fear itself. For Elena, this practice became something she did not just at sunset, but in smaller moments throughout her day. When she felt frustration rising, perhaps over a doctor's appointment that ran long, or a grandchild who forgot to call, she would pause, close her eyes for just a few seconds, and imagine herself rising above the moment, seeing herself as one small figure in an enormous, ancient, ongoing story of human life. And nearly every time the frustration lost its grip on her just a little. Seneca captured this same idea from a slightly different angle. He wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, and that so much of the pain we carry about growing older is not the pain of the present moment, but the pain of an imagined future, a future of decline and helplessness that has not actually arrived and may never arrive. In the form we fear, the view from above pulls us out of that imagined future and returns us to the only place life is actually lived, right now, in this exact moment, however ordinary or extraordinary it happens to be. Try this for yourself this week. Tonight, if you can, step outside, even for just 2 minutes, and look up. Let your worries about tomorrow shrink just slightly against the size of the sky. And if you do this, come back and tell us in the comments what it felt like, because I promise you, you will not be the only person in this community who needed to hear that their fears, however real, are not the whole story. Habit 4. Speak to yourself like someone worth respecting. There is a particular cruelty that many people direct at themselves as they age, a private, constant inner monologue of criticism that would be unthinkable to say aloud to another person. You look old. You are slower than you used to be. You are becoming a burden. This voice, for many people, grows louder with every passing year until it becomes the dominant soundtrack of their inner life. Elena knew this voice intimately. In the year following Thomas's death, she caught herself more than once, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, silently listing everything wrong with her reflection, the lines around her eyes, the way her hands had begun to look, in her words, like an old woman's hands, as though she were somehow separate from the old woman she now was. It was her grandson again who gently pointed her toward Marcus Aurelius's writings on this exact struggle. Marcus, despite ruling the most powerful empire on earth, was relentlessly, almost obsessively focused on the discipline of his own inner speech. He wrote to himself that he must not waste the remainder of his life in thoughts about other people unless he was thinking of them for some mutually beneficial reason, and that he should waste even less time in cruel thoughts about himself. He understood something that modern psychology has since confirmed through decades of research. The way we speak to ourselves internally shapes not just our emotional state, but our actual physiological stress response, our immune function, and over the long term, our biological aging process itself. This is not exaggeration. Longitudinal studies tracking older adults over decades have found a striking, consistent pattern. Individuals who hold more positive self-perceptions of their own aging, who do not internalize negative stereotypes about growing old, live measurably longer than those who hold negative self-perceptions, with some studies showing a difference of more than 7 years of additional life expectancy. 7 years. Not from diet, not from exercise, from the simple, daily discipline of how a person speaks to themselves about their own aging process. Seneca wrote extensively to his friend Lucilius about the danger of what he called borrowed opinions, the tendency to absorb the crowd's fears and judgments as though they were our own private truths. He warned that most people do not actually examine whether their fear of old age is their own considered conclusion or simply an inherited anxiety, absorbed unconsciously from a culture that worships youth and treats aging as a kind of failure. He urged his readers to examine their own inner voice the way a careful judge examines testimony, asking, is this true, or is this simply what I have been told to believe? Eleanor began a practice, again small and unglamorous, but powerful in its consistency. Each time she caught the critical voice rising, the voice cataloguing her wrinkles or her slower gait, she would pause and ask herself a single question, drawn directly from Stoic practice. Would I say this to someone I loved? The answer every single time was no. She would never have told her closest friend that her hands looked old and shameful. She would never have told her daughter that slowing down was a form of failure. And so, slowly, deliberately, she began extending to herself the same basic respect she had always extended to the people she loved. This is the fourth golden habit, and it is deceptively simple to describe and genuinely difficult to practice. Speak to yourself, especially about your own aging, with the same dignity you would offer someone you respect. Not false flattery, not denial of real physical change, but respect. The kind of respect Marcus Aurelius insisted on showing to every person he encountered, extended inward to the person he saw in the mirror each morning. A person growing older in an empire that was also slowly changing beneath him. I want to ask you honestly, and I hope you will be honest with yourself and with this community in the comments below, because so many people carry this quietly and never say it out loud. What does your inner voice say to you about your own aging? Is it a voice of respect or a voice of quiet contempt? Naming it, simply naming it, is often the first and most important step toward changing it. Habit 5. Find your daily work. One of the most persistent modern myths about aging is the idea that the ultimate goal of a long, working life is complete permanent leisure. Retire, rest, relax, and let the remaining years simply pass in comfortable idleness. The Stoics would have found this idea not just mistaken, but genuinely dangerous. Seneca, in his famous essay on the shortness of life, described people who spend their entire working years anticipating retirement as though life truly begins the moment obligation ends. And he observed something sharp and uncomfortable. Many of these people, once they finally reach that longed-for leisure, discover they no longer know what to do with themselves. That idle time without purpose curdles quickly into emptiness, and sometimes despair. Elena had spent 38 years as a schoolteacher before retiring at 63, 5 years before her fall. In the years immediately following retirement, before Thomas's death, she noticed something she found embarrassing to admit even to herself. She felt oddly purposeless. Her days, once structured tightly around lesson, plans and the urgent needs of 30 children at a time, had become loose, unstructured, quietly aimless. She filled the time, but she did not feel filled by it. The Stoics had a specific answer to this problem, one rooted deeply in their understanding of human nature. They believed that human beings are, by nature, purposeful creatures, that we are, in Marcus Aurelius's words, made for cooperation and contribution, the way the parts of a body are made to work together toward the health of the whole. He wrote that when he did not feel like getting out of bed in the morning, he reminded himself that he was born to work, in cooperation with the world, the way it is in the nature of a bee to make honey. A bee does not retire from being a bee. Purposeful work in some form was not, for the Stoics, a burden to be escaped in old age. It was a fundamental part of what it meant to remain fully human. This does not mean the Stoics were advocating for continuing to work a demanding career indefinitely, or that leisure has no place in a well-lived life. What they meant by daily work is something broader and more personal, some form of daily engagement, some project, some contribution, some purpose that pulls a person out of bed each morning with a reason, however modest, to be present in the world. For Marcus Aurelius, even as emperor of the known world, this daily work included his private philosophical writing, done in the quiet hours before dawn, a discipline he maintained his entire life, war camps included. Elena found her own version of daily work almost by accident. Roughly a year after Thomas's death, when a neighbor mentioned that the local elementary school, the very one Eleanor had taught at decades earlier, was struggling to find volunteers to help children who were behind in reading. Eleanor began volunteering 2 mornings a week, sitting with 8-year-olds who stumbled over words, guiding them patiently through sentences the way she had guided thousands of children before them. She told her grandson that those 2 mornings became, unexpectedly, the anchor of her entire week. Everything else, her walks, her evening reflections, her conversations with her daughter, seemed to organize itself more easily around those 2 purposeful mornings. There is compelling research supporting exactly what Elena discovered through lived experience. Studies of older adults who maintained some form of regular purposeful activity, whether paid work, volunteering, caregiving, creative projects or mentorship, consistently show lower rates of cognitive decline, lower rates of depression, and in several long-term studies, measurably lower mortality rates compared to demographically similar peers who do not maintain such activity. The specific form of the work seems to matter far less than the simple presence of it, a reason renewed each morning to engage fully with the world rather than withdraw from it. This is the 5th golden habit. Find your daily work, whatever form it takes at this stage of your life, and treat it with the same seriousness the Stoics treated their own callings. It does not need to be grand. It does not need to be paid. It simply needs to be yours, something that asks something of you, and in doing so, gives you back a reason to remain fully, purposefully alive. If you have found your own version of daily work in your later years, whether it is gardening, mentoring, caregiving, art, volunteering, or something entirely your own, I would genuinely love to know what it is. Share it in the comments below. This community grows stronger every time someone is generous enough to share what has actually worked in their own life. And someone watching this right now may find exactly the idea they needed in your comment. Habit 6. Rehearse adversity before it arrives. There is a Stoic practice that sounds, on first hearing, almost morbid. and yet those who understand it correctly describe it as one of the most liberating disciplines in the entire philosophy. The Stoics called it premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. The practice involves deliberately, calmly imagining in advance the difficulties that might come: illness, loss, physical decline, even death itself. Seneca wrote to Lucilius that nothing ought to be unexpected by us, that our minds should be sent forward in advance to meet every possible difficulty, so that when hardship actually arrives, we are not shattered by its novelty, but simply recognize an old, already considered visitor. This is not, as it might first appear, an invitation to pessimism or anxiety. Quite the opposite. Modern psychology has identified something remarkably similar in what is now called defensive pessimism and anticipatory coping, both of which have been shown in careful studies to reduce anxiety and improve resilience when practiced deliberately and calmly, as opposed to the chronic, uncontrolled worry that simply exhausts a person without producing any useful preparation. The key difference between anxious, worry and stoic premeditation is control and intention. Anxious worry is a mind spinning helplessly, reliving the same fear again and again without resolution. Stoic premeditation is a mind deliberately, calmly walking through a difficulty once, thoroughly, in order to prepare a considered response, and then setting the exercise down. Eleanor's encounter with this habit came, again, through grief, though this time not her own. Roughly 2 years after Thomas's death, her closest friend from the volunteer program at the elementary school, a woman named Margaret, received a difficult diagnosis. Watching Margaret navigate the uncertainty of what came next, Eleanor found herself, for the first time in years, truly afraid, not of her own aging, which she had made a kind of uneasy peace with, but of losing another person she deeply loved. It was in this fear that her grandson introduced her to premeditatio malorum, and she approached it, at first with real skepticism. It seemed cruel to sit and imagine Margaret's death, or her own, but she tried it anyway, carefully, guided by Seneca's own words on the subject. She sat quietly one evening and allowed herself to imagine, fully and honestly, a future in which Margaret was gone. She imagined the specific grief of it, the particular silence that would follow, the empty chair at their usual coffee spot. She did not rush through this. She let herself feel it, completely, for perhaps 15 minutes. And then, something Seneca had described precisely happened. The fear did not disappear, but it lost its formless, overwhelming quality. It became a known thing, a considered thing rather than a shapeless dread lurking at the edge of every good moment she still had with Margaret. More than that, Elena found that the exercise sharpened her gratitude for the present, in a way nothing else had. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we should embrace the things that happen to us as if we had asked for them to happen, and that this reframing, difficult as it sounds, changes our entire relationship with hardship. By rehearsing the loss of Margaret in advance, Elena found herself, paradoxically, more present with Margaret in the time they did have, less distracted by trivial irritations, more attentive to the actual conversations they were having in the actual mornings they still shared. This is the 6th golden habit, and it is perhaps the most misunderstood of the 7, precisely because it sounds dark on first encounter. Rehearsing adversity is not inviting suffering into your life prematurely. It is meeting suffering on your own terms, calmly, deliberately in advance, so that when it does arrive, as it eventually does for everyone, you are not meeting it for the first time in a state of total unpreparedness. It is, in a strange and very stoic way, an act of love, both for yourself and for the people you might one day have to let go of. I know this section may have touched something difficult for some of you watching, and if it has, I want you to know that is not a coincidence. And it is not something to look away from. Take a moment, if you are able to, and consider one difficult thing you have been avoiding thinking about entirely. You do not need to dwell on it forever. Just 15 honest minutes, the way Elena did, might change your relationship with it more than years of avoidance ever could. Habit 7. Live each day as a complete life. We have arrived finally at the habit I promised you at the very beginning of this video, the one that does not simply add to the other 6, but transforms how you understand every single one of them. And to explain it properly, I need to take you back to Marcus Aurelius one final time and to a passage. He wrote to himself that may be the single most important sentence in the entire Stoic tradition on the subject of aging. Marcus wrote that we should live as though we might depart from life at any moment, and that we should regard the present moment not as a fragment of some larger, ongoing story, but as a complete life in itself, one that could, in principle, stand entirely on its own. This idea, at first glance, might seem like simple memento mori, a reminder that death comes for everyone, useful mostly for generating urgency or fear. But that is a shallow reading of what Marcus actually meant, and it is not how the Stoics themselves understood it. What Marcus was describing was something closer to a complete reorientation of how a person relates to time itself. Most of us, especially as we age, live with an implicit assumption that today is merely a step towards some future completion, that our lives are unfinished projects, always building towards something further down the road. This creates a subtle but constant tension, a low hum of dissatisfaction, because if today only has value as a stepping stone toward tomorrow, then today itself is never quite enough. And this tension becomes acute in old age, when the number of remaining tomorrows visibly shrinks, and the pressure to reach some imagined finish line, some sense of completion, becomes almost unbearable. The Stoics offered a radical alternative. What if today, this exact day, however ordinary, is not a fragment of an unfinished project, but a complete life in itself? What if the goal was never to reach some distant point of completion, but simply to live each day, fully and virtuously, as though it were the whole of your life, condensed into these 16 or so waking hours? Under this view, aging loses its power to threaten you, because you are no longer racing toward a finish line that keeps receding. You are simply living completely today, and tomorrow, when it comes, will be its own complete life as well. Elena arrived at this final habit slowly, over the years following Thomas's death, through her walking, her volunteering, her evenings under the sky, her honest conversations with Margaret about mortality. But it crystallized for her fully on an ordinary Tuesday, the same day of the week Thomas had died, 4 years after his death. She woke early, as she always did now. She walked her 3 miles. She spent her morning at the elementary school, listening to an 8-year-old sound out the word brave for the first time. She had lunch with Margaret, whose diagnosis had, against difficult odds, stabilized. She sat in her garden that evening and watched the sky change color, the way she had for years now, and she realized, sitting there, that she was not waiting for anything. She was not counting down towards some future she needed to survive to reach. She was not mourning a past she could never return to. She was simply completely living that particular Tuesday, and it was, in its quiet, unremarkable way, enough. This is what it means to treat each day as a complete life, and it is why this 7th habit transforms the other 6 rather than simply joining them. The physical discipline of habit 1 is not preparation for some future healthy old age. It is today's complete expression of respect for the body you have right now. The acceptance of what you cannot control in habit 2 is not a strategy for some eventual peace. It is today's complete peace, available right now in this moment, regardless of what tomorrow holds. The daily work of habit 5 is not a bridge to some future sense of purpose. It is today's complete purpose, whole and sufficient in itself. Seneca captured this same understanding when he wrote that the whole of life is like a single day to the wise, containing everything necessary within it, and that the person who has learned to live one day fully has, in a very real sense, learned to live an entire life fully, because the same discipline, the same presence, the same virtue that fills one good day can fill any number of days, however many happen to be granted. Aging, under this view, is not a decline toward an ending. It is simply the accumulation of complete days, each one whole, each one sufficient. Each one lived, in Marcus Aurelius's words, as though it were the last, not out of morbid fear, but out of complete grateful presence. The bench in the park. Let us return finally to where we began. An old man on a park bench in Rome, writing in his private journal, making peace with a body that was failing him piece by piece. Marcus Aurelius did not have the luxury of modern medicine, of resistance training research, of longitudinal psychology studies proving that self-perception affects lifespan. He had only careful observation of his own life, and the accumulated wisdom of the philosophers before him. And yet, reading his private words today, nearly 2,000 years later, we find a blueprint for aging that remains, in every meaningful way, more sophisticated and more humane than most of what modern culture currently offers us. 7 golden habits. Train the body like you train the mind, because the vessel and the pilot cannot be separated. Master what you can control and release what you cannot, because fighting the unfightable is not courage, it is exhaustion without purpose. Practice the view from above, because your fears, however real, are smaller than the sky you fear them under. Speak to yourself like someone worth respecting, because 7 years of life have been measured in the simple difference between contempt and dignity toward your own aging self. Find your daily work, because purpose is not a luxury reserved for the young. It is the honey a person, like a bee, was always meant to make. Rehearse adversity before it arrives, not out of fear but out of love, so that when hardship comes, you meet it as a known visitor rather than a stranger who catches you unprepared. And live each day as a complete life, because the moment you stop, treating today as a stepping stone towards some future completion, aging loses its power to threaten you at all. Elena is 73 now. Her hands still show the years. Her hips still ache sometimes before rain. She still grieves Thomas quietly on certain Tuesdays. But she told her grandson something recently that I want to leave you with, because I think it captures everything these 7 habits are ultimately pointing toward. She said that she used to think growing old meant slowly disappearing. And now, 4 years into practicing these habits, she understands it differently. Growing old, she said, is not disappearing. It is arriving more and more completely at exactly who you were always capable of becoming. If this video meant something to you, if even one of these 7 habits landed in a place that needed it, I want to ask you for 3 things. And I promise I will not ask you again for a while, because this community has never needed to be asked twice. First, if you have not already, subscribe to Wisdom of the Stoics, because we are building something here, week after week, for people who are ready to face life and aging with clear eyes and real strength, rather than fear and denial. Second, leave a comment below telling us which of these 7 habits you most need to begin practicing today, because I read every single one, and so does this community, and your honesty might be exactly what someone else needed to read today. And third, if you know someone, a parent, a friend, someone in your life who is quietly afraid of growing older, share this video with them. Not because they need fixing, but because, like Marcus Aurelius on that bench, like Elena on her Tuesday evening, they deserve to know that the years ahead are not a decline to be feared, but a craft to be mastered, one complete deliberate day at a time. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until next time, this has been Wisdom of the Stoics, ancient wisdom for the modern mind.